Um, Jordan Fezler and I work on the commercial division here at City and State Real Estate. I am also a CCIM, which means I'm a huge real estate nerd. Um, it stands for Certified Commercial Investment Member. Primarily, it helps go deeper into analysis of um, income, expenses, and then kind of the time value of money. So, what happens 10 years from now in an investment property? What is your overall rate of return? We're going to go over some basics. There's a lot of really great brokers I know in the residential space, and I see some of you here today that want to learn more about commercial. And it is absolutely a different process, different dynamic. And so this is going to be a good primer of how commercial real estate is different in terms of the resources you use, in terms of the process, timelines, costs, all those different things. Jordan's going to be piping in, helping out, and then we're going to wrap up by giving you a real-time current wrap-up of multiple market sectors, and Jordan's going to be leading that. I'm really excited to hear what's going on with retail and office and apartments here in the Portland area, and that's something that he spends all day, every day working on. So I am going to share my screen now. All right, you guys should be. Jordan, are you seeing the slides here?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to hit present so we get full screen. All right, let me go back to slide one. All right, welcome to Intro to Commercial Real Estate. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you see me looking sideways and pausing, it's because we're adding more people as they come in. So just get through it. So as I mentioned, I'm a CCIM. I'm also the CEO of City and State Real Estate in Oregon and Washington. And I wrote a book called The Golden Handoff about how to buy and sell a real estate agent's business. And today we're going to go over the basics of what makes commercial real estate different than residential and kind of how you can learn about the differences. So first big thing is the types of property. I was talking to someone recently and they said the best way to describe commercial real estate is to say that it's everything that isn't a house. So if it's not a house or a condo, it falls under one of these categories. So land, industrial, multifamily, and that's everything from 2 units to 2,000 units, retail, and office. A lot of times in Portland, you'll see these kind of mixed up. So you'll see ground floor retail with some office and some apartments. You typically don't see industrial mixed with anything other than office, although we've started to see a lot of industrial properties in Portland get redeveloped into incubator space with retail storefronts. So you sometimes see industrial, retail, and office combined. Everything has land involved, and we're going to talk about zoning and use later. And that's where that's really critical to understand those differences. So those are the main food groups, as we call them, or the categories of commercial real estate. I want to talk a little bit about distressed properties. We really haven't dealt much with distressed properties in really like the last 12 years. So, or 8 years, I guess. But this is something that has happened cyclically. Real estate does not go up in a straight line. We're seeing some major cities like San Francisco and New York City right now have some pretty big pullbacks in their residential markets. And obviously with everything going on with COVID, there's going to be there currently are a lot of issues and will be more issues with retail and office, and especially in some hard hit areas like, say, downtown Portland, where we've had not only COVID shutdowns, but we've had civil unrest that's been very, very disruptive for businesses and for retail and office properties. So there's really two types of distressed properties. REO is real estate owned. That's kind of a lingo for bank owned property. So that's after a property has had trouble, it was foreclosed, and then it ends up for sale by the bank. So a lot of times these are sold at auction, but if it doesn't sell at the auction, then it ends up back owned by the bank and then they sell it. The other one is a short sale. Now in a short sale, you're still buying the property from the owner. They're still really in charge of making decisions, but they owe the bank more than they're going to get from the sale. And so the bank has to approve what they're being shorted. And that's why it's called a short sale. The joke when these started back in 2008 and 9 was that they didn't take a short amount of time. They should call them long sales, because oftentimes it can take months or even up to a year to get approvals from the bank to do a sale. The other thing we're going to see a lot of, I think, is bankruptcies. We've already seen quite a few of those within the new construction space, but with a bankruptcy, so kind of in short order here, bank-owned properties, the bank is the seller and they make the decisions. In a short sale, the current owner is the seller, but they have to get approval from the bank for the amount they're selling it for. With a bankruptcy, there's a trustee involved, and that is the person that is charged with selling the property. They act as the seller, representing the interest of the creditors. So that's kind of the difference. They all have a little bit different process. I think we're going to see more of those. So it's interesting to kind of get up to speed. Jordan and I recently just closed on a 20-unit apartment that was a short sale with multiple lenders, some traditional lenders and some private lenders. And so that was a very complicated, long-term process to get the approvals from everyone that we needed to be able to close that deal. So the main thing we use when we're looking at analyzing properties, so if someone said, hey, I want to buy a property and I want to get a good deal. So if you're a broker, you hear that a lot. I want a good deal. Well, that means different things to different people. And if you have 3 different options, let's say you're looking at 3 different properties and you want to decide which one is the best deal, an APOD is a great way to figure that out. And that stands for Annual Property Operating Data. And it takes everything into the whole year and kind of makes it easy to read in one form and gives you some different metrics, which we're going to talk about as well. Metrics are ways to measure things. So the way you use an APOD is, and if you're having trouble seeing this, you have the ability to zoom in and out on your end and make this a little bit bigger. And we're happy to send an email to everyone that's on the call today with a copy of this you can use. So you have your loan information, and if you're paying cash, then basically your down payment is 100%. You have and then that'll create, use an amortization calculator to figure out your monthly and annual payments. And then you have your total units. So obviously, if you have more than 2 units, you just keep adding to this. If it's just one big warehouse, you have 1 unit. If you might have a mix of units. So typically when we sell apartments, there'll be a mix of studios and 1 bedrooms, or 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms. So if you had, 6 1 bedrooms and 6 2 bedrooms, you just put, 1 bed, 2 bed, and there'd be 6 of each, and the total rent per month. And then that calculates up the total rent, which gives you your annual rent. Now, if every unit is rented all the time, that's called your potential rental income. That's theoretical because we do have vacancy. Sometimes people don't pay rent. Right now, I think, Jordan, it's 10 to 15% of tenants are not paying rent in the apartment space right now?
I don't think it's quite to 10%.
A little under 10?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you take out
vacancies are typically underwritten at 5 or 6%.
Yeah, we've been using 5 for a long time, and I know that the downtown core is above 6 now. So we take out your vacancy and your credit losses, and that means people not paying, and that gives you your effective rental income. And then you add in, this is additional income. So RUBS and pet rent. RUBS is rental utility bill back. So that's, let's say you charge $1,000 a month for a studio apartment, but then you charge everyone an extra $50 for utilities. That's what RUBS are. So you add that in as additional income. Typically now people will charge not only an additional deposit for pets, but they'll charge what's called pet rent. And we're seeing $25 a month per pet, Jordan? Is that kind of the going rate?
That's across the board. Yep.
Yeah. So then you add that in as other income. So it kind of increases your rent, and that gives you your gross income. And then you take out your other expenses. So operating expenses. So you've got taxes, insurance, management. In Portland, there's a landlord fee. Different cities and counties and states will have different rules and fees and taxes that you have to maybe account for here. And then we put in repairs and maintenance. Usually we figure 4% of the annual gross operating income is a fair number for what to account for when you are looking at what you think the repairs and maintenance are going to be. And then you kind of have your basic stuff. So garbage, water, sewer. If it's a newer building, you probably have fire sprinklers, and then you have to have monitoring. If you've got a lot of land, you've got landscaping, and then you've got your power bills. Typically for the common areas in really old buildings, sometimes there's only 1 meter for water and sewer and 1 meter for electric or gas. In that case, the only way to get that money back is to charge RUBS and get some of that money back in your leases. So now you have your expenses, you take out your expenses, you get your net operating income, or NOI. You'll hear that a lot if you do investment real estate. And again, that's your net operating income before your mortgage payments. That's really important because different people are going to choose different loans with different amortization periods, with different interest rates. And so you can't compare the property based on the debt. You have to look at it without that when you're comparing it. Now, for that investor, you definitely want to know about their cost of funds or their debt service, because if you want to know what your real cash on cash return is, you need to know how much money you have invested and what you're paying for the money you're borrowing. So you have your net operating income here, you take out your annual mortgage payments. Now, keep in mind when you're taking out annual mortgage payments, you're not doing it with like a typical residential where you do a PITI, or principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. This is just principal and interest. You're already counting your taxes and insurance up here as hard cost expenses, so you don't count them twice. And then you have your cash flow before taxes. To do that, you have to know the loan amount and the loan terms and the payments. And when you have that, you can figure out everything. So we start here with cap rate. That's the most commonly used. We have gross rent multiplier, which is a really good, very easy way to look at things, because all you need to know is what are the gross rents and what is the purchase price. The hardest thing to figure out is cash on cash, because you have to have all of the loan information in order to do that. We also do price per door or price per unit, and we figure out expense ratios as well. Sometimes that will help you figure out if a property is operating efficiently, or if for some reason they're spending too much money on expenses. So over here, we kind of talked about this. So soft costs versus hard costs. So soft costs are flexible. So your interest rate, your management fee, your repairs and maintenance. Obviously, an older building is going to have higher higher maintenance costs. A new building will have almost no maintenance cost. A property with a large grounds and lots of amenities like a community pool and gym and meeting rooms, a lot more maintenance and repair costs, as opposed to a building with just like studios with no yard. You're going to have very little in the way of maintenance and repairs. The bigger the unit count, typically the cheaper percentage on management. If you just have a house, you might be paying 10%. And if you are doing 100 units, you might be paying 3 or 4%. Vacancy, like Jordan said, we've been using 5% for quite a long time as kind of our standard vacancy. That is going up, and I think that will continue to increase just because we have a pretty big unemployment problem nationally, and we have a lot of restrictions right now on rent increases, evictions because of COVID. And so there's a lot of tenants that aren't paying because they don't have to, but that will come to a close, and they'll either get caught up or they'll have to move out. And your operating expenses, that's the other thing you have some control over, that you can manage that. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat. Someone had mentioned they couldn't see the presentation, but we're all seeing this, right? Okay, good. I see people nodding. Thanks. So here's how you do the math on these metrics. So gross rent multiplier is also known as a GRM, and that's your acquisition price divided by gross rents, and it's a multiplier. And typically, the lower that number, the better for the buyer, and the higher that number, the better for the seller. Right now, Jordan, where would you see the market is on GRM right now for plexus? You were saying, we were talking about this yesterday, is around 12?
Yeah, 12 anywhere on the outer banks of Portland. So if you're going close in a property that has more location value and has higher appreciation value, you see a higher GRM.
Right. So lower rate of return to the buyer.
Yeah, and then somewhere, 70th to 120th, you're seeing GRMs.
You mean Avenue,
Oh,
right? Like in like outer East Portland?
yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks.
Yep. So the sexier close-in properties typically have a higher GRM.
Yeah. So just in simple numbers, if you had $12,000 a year in gross rents and you had a GRM of 10, it would mean that the property would be worth 120,000. And so if you had a property, same thing, where the GRM was 5, it would be 200, or it would be $50,000. And if you had a 20 GRM, it would be $200,000 or 240. So that's kind of how that works. That's the easiest one to figure out because you only need to know these two numbers. The next thing you can figure out is cap rate. To do cap rate, you have to figure out your expenses. So instead of gross rents, you're going to use net operating income, and you divide it by your acquisition price, and that gives you a cap rate. And that's expressed as a percentage. The percentage cap rate lately has been 5 to 6%. Jordan, is that kind of what you're seeing in the multifamily space?
Yes.
So that means for every, say, if you have a building that you buy for $1 million and it has a 6% cap rate, that means um, after all of your expenses, you would have $60,000, and then from that, you still need to pay your mortgage if you have a mortgage. So um, that's how you figure out a cap rate. Cash on cash return, you have to have the most information because you need to know cash flow before taxes. And what that is your net operating income minus your debt service. So that's your 60,000 minus your mortgage payments, and then how much money you invested. So that's your down payment plus your loan fees, appraisals, inspections, whatever you spent to buy the property. That's what that is. Jordan's buying a multifamily property right now. There's some units that have been vacated, so they're upgrading those. So that would be added to your money invested, would be your down payment plus your remodel improvements, and then that'll give you a true cash on cash return. And the big thing here is that this is how much money you're making on the money you actually invested. So here's some tools for commercial real estate. CoStar and LoopNet, that's kind of basically the MLS for commercial realtors. Those programs, I want to say LoopNet's 110 a month and CoStar is around 500 a month per agent. It gives you pretty good data. It's not as perfect as, I would say the data in RMLS is actually more accurate, but RMLS does not have a lot of the information you would need to do an evaluation on a commercial property or to see what's available, because many of the large commercial brokerages are not members of the MLS. Another program is called Vertical Email. I love this program. It's basically an email listserv for commercial brokers all over the West Coast. I think into Idaho and Montana too. And you can search for properties on that, or you can email all the brokers and investors that are members when you have a property for sale. Portland Maps, a lot of folks that are in residential are familiar with this, but this is our citywide GIS, our geographical information system. And this allows you to search for the zoning, look at the lot size, look at permit histories, all that. We have got CAB forms here. That's the Commercial Association of Brokers. We're members of both, PMAR and the Commercial Association of Brokers. So we have access to their forms. That's typically what folks use when they're doing commercial deals, or they'll have an attorney draft an entirely custom sale agreement. And if you are trying to do commercial and you're mostly a residential agent, sometimes you'll get an offer in and they'll push back and say, well, we want to do it on this form, because most commercial brokers are going to be more familiar with the CAB forms than the OREF forms. The other thing is LOIs and offers. So in residential, typically you just go into OREF or ZIP form and you put together a full sale agreement, and that's what you present. It's very common in commercial real estate that you start with what's called a letter of intent, or an LOI. And that's basically like a one-pager that is non-binding, that says, hey, we'll pay you $1 million. We want 60 days inspection, close in 90 days. And we want information on these, the leases and the survey and, extra, et cetera, et cetera. And then if everyone can agree on that, then you put it on a full sale agreement. The other thing is that contract standards are very different in commercial versus residential. The timelines are longer. Your buyers are gonna have to spend quite a bit more on due diligence and inspections if they want to do it prudently. And so your timeline, basically the big thing is your timelines are just much longer. And in residential, a lot of your timelines are fixed. So you have 10 days for inspections, you have a set time for appraisal, you've got a set time for closing, you've got a set time for reviewing the prelims. In commercial, it's pretty common that the seller will have 10 business days to provide a list of 20 documents that the buyer wants, and then the buyer will have a certain review time from when they get the documents. That way you're not stuck getting a stack of paperwork and only having a couple days left to review it. So the timelines and the process in commercial is a lot more complicated and drawn out, just because there are a lot more layers to the onion when you're doing a commercial deal to do it correctly. So here are some differences between commercial and residential. Like I said, contracts, residential, you typically use OREF forms, and commercial, you typically use CAB forms or custom forms or letters of intent. Residential, your RMLS is absolutely the gold standard. You really don't need anything beyond that. But in commercial, you need to also have CoStar, LoopNet, and vertical email. We also use RMLS. There's not much in the way of commercial listed there, but there definitely are some things. So it is part of the searches, but you can't rely on that. Financing, 30-year fixed mortgage is really the standard practice in residential. You might have a 15-year. No one's really using ARMs or anything else right now because rates are so low on the fixed mortgages. In commercial, you might have hard money, private money, bridge financing, construction financing, SBA financing, Fannie Freddie financing, traditional conventional commercial financing. The thing about that that's interesting, I just bought a large commercial property myself, and I was talking to 10 or 12 different banks and lenders. I narrowed it down to my top 3. And all of the terms are negotiable. So they have kind of a range of what they do, but you can still negotiate pretty much every aspect of the loan. And so it's totally different than residential. And so in commercial, kind of residential, you get what you get. In commercial, you get what you ask for. And the more money you're able to put down, the better the terms will be. But the banks have tons of leeway on what they can do. And in residential, it is absolutely not the case. Main factors for helping people with residential property: location and emotional preference. Commercial location is always still important, but you're looking at zoning. And in the case of investment properties, you're looking at income, expenses, you're looking at financials, and those are the determining factors. Someone's not going to pay double for something just because it's in a great location if they want an investment that makes money. So zoning and occupancy. So the important thing, when I talked about land earlier, I mentioned this. Land, in most cases, has zoning. There are some states that don't and some cities that don't. I believe Houston still doesn't have zoning. And I think I just read something recently that I think like the state of Nebraska doesn't have zoning. But in Oregon and Washington, we definitely do. And so you need to understand there's a difference here. So zoning is what's allowed on the land, regardless of what's on it. So if you have a vacant piece of land and it's zoned CM2, that allows you to do retail, office, apartments, maybe some light manufacturing, but not heavy industrial. Now, you could also have a neighborhood where it was rezoned and maybe you've got a house on that lot, but it's zoned CM2, right? So you might think, hey, it's zoned commercial, so I can do whatever I want, even though it's just an old house on that lot. Pretty common in Portland to see that scenario. But the difference is you'd be correct that the zoning allows that, but that occupancy certificate for that building is specific to that building. And in this case, if you're talking about an old house, it's zoned for residential. So just because you could have a restaurant or a dress shop or an apartment building there, it doesn't mean you can just all of a sudden open a restaurant in your old house because of the zoning, because you have another layer, which is your occupancy class. And every property has an occupancy certificate. The thing that's interesting is if you work in residential, you never know that or look at it because you're typically just helping people buy and sell houses, and it's just assumed that your occupancy certificate is for residential. But when you're doing commercial, you need to understand both zoning, which is, again, that goes with the land, and then the occupancy, which is specific to the building. And depending on what you're going to do to change the occupancy, you could be looking at significant time and money invested to make the changes that would be required to take, say, an old house to a restaurant. In some cases, it would be so expensive, you're better off tearing it down and just building a new one. So again, just kind of mention that zoning is what's allowed by right on the land. I don't know why there's a question mark there. That's actually true. And the use in the occupancy class, that's what's allowed in the specific building. So one of the other things that's different in the process is typically you are, in residential, you do environmental studies, but it's usually limited to an oil tank, potentially soil sample, which has a very specific process to resolve if there's, or remediate if there's a leak. And some people are doing lead paint sampling. Again, there's a specific process to mitigate that. But in commercial, you have to look not only at your property, but you have to look at the history of the property, and you have to look at the history of the surrounding properties. And what they're typically trying to figure out is there contamination in the groundwater or soil on that property based on the uses? And the ones that are the worst are, you know, chemical manufacturing, painting buildings, and kind of the worst offenders are gas stations. So sometimes you'll see old historic gas stations. Typically see that on corner properties, but it's not a rule. If your phase 1 study determines that there was potential for contamination, then you would have to move to a phase 2 study where they actually do soil samples and drill. And unlike an oil tank sample where they might take 3 samples, they might take, depending on the size of the property, 10, 20, 30 samples to figure out what's going on under the ground. Phase 1, Jordan, right now, those are running what, 2,000 to 3,000?
1,500 to 2,500.
Okay. And then a phase 2, it really kind of depends on the scope of the property, but typically those are going to be more like 5 to 10 grand is, I think, kind of what you'd ballpark looking at. Does that sound crazy?
The 10, that's pretty high. That's pretty high, but
Okay.
5 to 7-ish.
Yeah. And again, if you have a small, you know, 10,000 foot corner lot, you need less samples than if you had a 20-acre industrial property. So again, it's going to be site by site specific, and the size matters in terms of the cost there. All right, let's talk about the money. So in residential, you're pretty much doing residential loans. Every once in a while, you can use that to buy a property that's zoned commercial. I've done that. My first property I bought was zoned storefront commercial, which is no longer a zoning. I believe it's CM2 now. But I was able to get a residential loan because it was a house with an occupancy class for a house. And I actually lived in it for a little while. My first house in Portland back in 2006 down in Sellwood. But typically you're going to be looking at a commercial loan. That's kind of a broad strokes name. There's a million different ways to do that. Hard money in residential and commercial is fairly similar. In commercial, they typically call it a bridge loan, but it's just, again, higher interest rate, shorter term, usually 6 months to 2 years. Construction loans are used when you're building or you're doing significant renovations or remodels. Typically, you would have a loan to buy the property, and then you would have also a construction loan. If you're doing ground up development, you typically start with a construction loan, and then you go into a permanent loan after the construction is finished. And the other big difference is residential loans, you know, again, most of them are 30-year fixed. You can go 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. Commercial loans typically are 3 to 10 years, 5 being kind of the most common. So the deal I just did, it's a 5-year loan, and then the interest rate can adjust up for another 5-year period. So I've got a 10-year loan. At the end of that 10 years, I have to do a full refinance or pay it off, or if I've sold it, then obviously we get paid off at sale. Again, within commercial loans, you've got SBA, Fannie, Freddie. SBA loans are owner-occupied loans. You can go as low as 10%. You have to use 51% of the building or more. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans are typically used on sized apartments. And then there are also USDA loans, but we don't typically deal with those because we don't do a lot in rural areas. But that's kind of and then you have your just what you call conventional commercial loans as well, which is going to be, your 25 to 35% down, 5 years fixed, with a variable interest rate. Another big difference, and this is not strictly commercial. You could have a residential house that was a rental and do a 1031 exchange, but basically a 1031 exchange is something you can use on any property held in the United States for commercial investment or business purposes. And what it basically means is like, it's any property that you don't live in or it's not a vacation home. So we're gonna, so a 1031 exchange, what it means is basically, let's say, so for example, I bought a little house in North Portland that was a fixer. I fixed it up. I rented it out for a couple years. And then I think I was into it for 200 grand and I sold it for 300. Well, I have a gain of $100,000 and I either can pay the capital gains tax on that or I can do an exchange. And the exchange allows you to sell a property and buy another investment property, and it doesn't get rid of the taxes, but it's a capital gains tax deferral. And so instead of me paying the taxes on that $100,000 gain, I go buy another property for $300,000 or more that's an investment or business property, and then I don't have to pay that capital gains. There's a couple really important rules with that. You have to make sure you have an exchange provider picked out before closing, because you can't ever touch the money. If you're the owner, the money has to go from your escrow to an escrow account with the exchange provider, and then they hold that money until you go buy another property that has to be the same price or higher. And you have to notify the IRS within 45 days of which property you're buying, or if you can pick a couple options. We always recommend people do it quicker than that and make sure they have it in escrow and hopefully through inspections before their timeline is up to notify the IRS. And then you have 180 days from closing of your sale to close on the other sale. Most people don't need that much time, but that's how much time you have. I'm getting some questions in the chat and I'm seeing all those. So stick around to the end and I'll make sure we answer all those questions, and we'll have time for Q&A as well. So I think right now, Jordan, you're up.
Great. So I'm going to go do a quick rundown of what's going on in the Portland metro area. So this is including Vancouver, goes into Beaverton, Oregon City. So this is a big snapshot of what we're seeing in the whole Portland metro area. So I'm going to go over the 4 key asset types and what's happening. Multifamily. So there's been an increase of units available by 3.5%. This is from a year from yesterday, basically. We've seen a significant decrease in construction, almost down 41%, which is a really huge number. What we're anticipating with a decrease in construction is we're going to see the rental market tighten up in probably 2 to 3 years. We can use that as indicators when we're looking at multifamily properties. Is this a good purchase? Can we increase our rents? What's it going to look like in 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line? What this tells me, if I'm seeing a decrease in construction by 41%, is that the rents are going to remain relatively flat for the next few years. And then with hopefully more positive migration coming here, the rental market's going to tighten up again, and we'll probably see rents start to increase significantly. Vacancy, it's slightly up. We're seeing an increase in vacancy in the core of Portland. A lot of people have been moving out because of everything that's been happening in this town, moving out to the burbs. They're getting a little bit lower rent and getting a little bit more space. Um, Market asking rent, which this is some real-time data that we have. We're not sure that we're actually seeing that in the field, but the market asking rent in the Portland area is $1,371. It's pretty flat from last year. Um, we actually believe that it's coming down a little bit, though the data is not showing that. We'll see what happens when a new market report comes out. As far as sales go for multifamily, the average sales price is $240,000 per unit. So if you have a 10 unit multifamily, the average price for door might be 240,000, so 2.4 million. There's a lot of variables when it comes to that. This is a pretty broad look at it. So there's many things that we have to look at when you're evaluating the actual price per unit on a property. Market cap rate is at 4.8%. This is still a very low cap rate. You know, a lot of investors that you talk to may be saying that they want a 6 or 7 or an 8 cap. And that would be fantastic if you're able to achieve that. It's very unlikely in the Portland market or the surrounding areas. They've been floating around 5% for a few years now, and will probably remain that way as interest rates are very low and money is pretty cheap. 12-month sales volume is significantly down, almost $900 million of decrease in sales of multifamily from last year. So that's a really big number. A lot of people have been scared by this pandemic, haven't wanted to list their properties. And that's where we've been seeing a significant decrease. The buildings close in, 4 and 5 star buildings, are seeing significantly higher vacancies than any other type of multifamily. So you're talking about the Portland core, the high-rise multifamilies with, you know, 2 bedrooms, you know, close to $3,000 a month. They're seeing a lot more vacancies on that. And one thing that is, you know, been playing out and has been a big challenge for a lot of property owners right now is the moratoriums on vacating tenants and also a deferment of rents. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but it's been a big headline across the state and in Portland. If any tenant is struggling because of COVID reasons, they do not have to pay their landlord. The payment is deferred, and that deferment has been extended into, I think, the end of Q1 of next year. But they can basically live in that property without paying anything right now. And they'll have to pay them at some point, but I don't know how they're going to come up with that, an extra 10 grand in a few months that they haven't paid. So it's a big problem. It's scaring a lot of landlords. And we'll see how it plays out in the end, but it's a big deal. We'll go ahead to the next one, Nick. Retail, since this pandemic hit, this is one of the most volatile assets that's out there. This, you know, includes restaurants, bars, all these types of retail where people like to go to spend their time, to socialize, and they can't really open their doors. So there's been a significant dip in the Portland retail market. Again, construction has decreased by almost 40% on retail. That's pretty much across the board for all assets. Something that stands out to me on this is the net absorption. So there's less people renting space than is becoming available. So there is as I'm sure you're seeing, there's been a lot of vacancies. There's a lot of for lease signs coming up. Um,
And
and
Jordan, real quick, so when you have that, that's negative 616,000 square feet. Is that correct?
yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Negative, and that's down from a positive number from just a year ago, a positive million almost. So it has come down almost 1.6 million square feet in just about a year.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a staggering number, and it's really hitting a lot of these retail property owners very hard. We may see some foreclosures sometime next year because of it, because they're not able to pay their lenders. It could be an opportunity for some people who want to pick up a property for pennies on the dollar. We'll see how it plays out, but it's something to keep an eye on. Even with that said, market rents haven't changed very much. Um, and um, the market sales price, those haven't really changed very much in retail either. I think significant adjustments yet on their cap rate expectations, and less deals are getting done. So this is definitely a scary asset class to be in right now. We'll go ahead to the next one, Nick. To my internet, am I still here, guys? Okay. Nick, were you able to change that?
I changed it. I got frozen out. Are you still going?
Yeah. Oh, I'm still going, but we don't see that shared screen.
I'm reconnecting right now.
I'll just go ahead and start talking while Nick brings it up. The industrial market is a very strong asset right now. It's one of the strongest assets, and it's at an all-time high for the city of Portland and Vancouver. There's a lot of big box businesses moving in here, or moving products, places like Amazon, Safeway, Costco. The closer into the core that they can get, where there's the highest density, is part of their last mile. And if the closer they are, the more cost savings they can have. Um, there we go. So we got it back up. So there's been if you can see this sheet now, construction is down 30%. So we keep hearing this number. Construction's been down basically across every single asset. With industrial markets tightening up here, it's created a higher demand. So rents have been increasing by 4%. That's a pretty big number for industrial. You usually don't see something jump up that high. And vacancy is only at 4.5%. There's very few availabilities if you're looking for lease space. And the price per square foot on a sale of a building is up almost 6% over a 1 year period. So those are very nice numbers if you're a property owner. We're likely going to see that continue to increase as there's a lot more demand for close-in industrial properties here in Portland, and the availability is very limited. So industrial markets, a great space to be in. All right, next we can go to the office. It looks like everyone's working from home that I can see here. So I'm assuming that you guys kind of have an idea that the office market is also very volatile. So the retail and office are the two sectors that are really trying to figure things out. How's it going to look in the next year or two? if we get a vaccine, if there's cures for COVID, will people be going back into the office? These are a lot of questions that people are trying to get answered. The dynamic's going to change in some capacity. We just don't know what. Might be shared desk or hoteling is what they're calling it. It's certainly going to be a dynamic changing market over the next 2 to 5 years. Construction also down significantly. Let's look at this number, absorption. This one is a negative 1.2 million. This is a significant reduction. I personally have a couple offices that I'm trying to lease, and it's very, very quiet. The likelihood of leasing in 6 months on a space in an office is only 32%. So it's less likely that I'm going to get this office space leased in the next 6 months than I am.
You got to lower the price.
What's that?
You got to lower the price.
It almost has to be free. I mean, people aren't going into the office. I mean, some people are, small offices are, but that's what we're seeing in that market. So
it's going to be tough for sure.
Yeah. So I'm basically categorizing retail and office in the same space. There might be some great opportunities out there in the next year to pick up some office and retail space for potentially pretty cheap. But there's going to be a lot of risk with that. So you gotta really look at the market and understand the market and know what you're getting yourself into. And know that there's some inherent risk when you take on a property like this with the changing market that we have. That's all I have for that, Nick.
Well, Jordan, you're relatively, it doesn't sound like it because you obviously know the market and you're doing a lot of transactions, but a lot of people don't know this, but you've only been doing commercial real estate for 2 years now?
Yeah, a little over 2 years.
And so I think it'd be great for you to share kind of what were some of your big ahas or kind of the hard part of the learning curve for you in learning commercial real estate. What are some of the things that if we go back in on like the first week, I could be like, hey, heads up, there's a couple of things you should know. What would that be?
I think you should know that there's more sale fails in commercial than there are in residential. A lot of it's numbers. It's if numbers don't work, then people will bail out of the deal. So it's less emotional. So I think that was one of the big learning curves on that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I think, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that's true. I think, that because it isn't a place you're going to live in, it's not like you have to get the house closed because your kids are starting school. It's an investment. It's a less emotional decision. There's still a lot of emotion in commercial real estate. I think that's one of the things I hear a lot from people is, oh, hey, I want to do commercial because there's no emotions. Well, when people are making or losing a lot of money, it can get emotional. And I would say the other big learning curve in commercial is just how much more complicated it is. I started out in residential and I switched to commercial. And in the last year, I've helped a couple of clients that I've known a long time with residential transactions. And I was kind of shocked at honestly, like how much easier it was than a commercial transaction and how the buyers are usually, once you get it in contract, they're committed to closing it. I would say, another thing you mentioned, cap rate, and we talked about it a couple of times, people wanting to get a great deal. If the market is 6% cap rate and someone wants an 8 or 9 or 10% cap rate, what that means is that there's more risk in that deal, meaning that there's work to be done, or there's vacancy problems, or there's management problems, or the location isn't great. And so it's kind of difficult to get a better than market deal because, for example, if you bought a property that was an 8 cap, chances are you have to do a bunch of repairs to it. By the time you make all those repairs, it probably is ended up being a 6 cap again when you factor that in. So, you know, sometimes things can look like a great deal, but you really want to take into account, um, you know, things like rehab costs. If you're going to have a bunch of work to do, you're going to have a bunch of lost time and lost rent versus buying maybe something that isn't as much of a great deal, or, you know, it has a lower cap rate, but you don't need to fix everything and all the tenants are already there. So you start collecting rent on day one. So those are some things to keep in mind. And so we got some stuff in chat. I want to just read it out loud. I know, James, you had asked, I remember 2 questions from the chat, and I put it in there, but if you have a question, please put it in the chat, because when our thing glitched out, we lost our chat, unfortunately. So I know James had asked how much a phase 2 costs. It's completely dependent on the size of the property and how much sampling needs to be done. I would say, I think Jordan, we said 5 to 10,000. I think $8,000 is pretty normal for a phase 2 environmental report. But again, if it's a gas station and it's on 2 acres, surrounded by industrial buildings that did solvents and paints, it could be significantly more. And another question was, I think Lisa had asked about lending. And I think the question was really about what lenders we use, or if you could ask that question again. So I'm going to just assume I remember that question, which was, who are the lenders you use in commercial? And the answer is, because it's so negotiable, what's really important is to have relationships with a lot of different banks and credit unions, or have a really good commercial mortgage broker. And because each bank is going to have different levels of their percentage of loans. So like a bank might have 80% of their loans in apartments and only 20% of it in office on their commercial portfolio. And all of a sudden they might decide, whoa, we've got way too many apartments. We don't want to have this many. And so they might still do the loan on it, but they want way more money down, or the interest rate's much higher. Whereas the credit union across the street at that moment in time might say, hey, we have way too much office and retail. We need more apartments. And so then they offer special deals. And so the thing that's important is the appetite for different property types and locations is always changing with banks. And the interest rate for a retail building or an office building or an apartment building, one bank might be favoring apartments while the other might be favoring office. So you just have to understand, and it's not like this is published. You have to just call people and build relationships. And that's where having a good commercial mortgage broker can really help, because hopefully they're having those conversations and they know, hey, you know, this XYZ bank is saying that they'll do 3% apartment loans, but we know that they don't really want to do those because our last 3 clients got declined and they were good, but they want to do office. If you want to do an apartment, you need to go to, you know, XYZ credit union. And then they really actually love doing apartment deals, even though their interest rate's half a point higher.
I would jump in and say that commercial lenders, it's way more competitive, and a lot of them make their own rules. So you have the ability to leverage a better deal for yourself or your buyer.
I think, James, you had a follow-up, is how much is remediation if the phase 2 turns something up? It's just, that is too broad of a question to give you an answer. It's literally specific to every single property. So that could be, I had a big commercial deal for an industrial park go up because there was $500,000 to $1 million worth of remediation that was needed on a $5 million deal. So the buyer and seller could not come to terms on how to deal with that. And so the buyer decided not to purchase the property. So that's the largest I've seen. Personally, they can go higher than that if it's a major industrial site. And then you could have something very small, like you could have a commercial deal with a residential oil tank where it costs $3,000 to take care of it. So it can kind of be all over the map. Jana asked the question, has retail restaurant market in downtown or the Pearl dropped in price? Or is it expected to? Are there deals in the market yet? Couple different questions there. So Jordan, I think that the report doesn't show a major drop in retail.
I mean, they're still asking for 22. Core Pearl is going to be much different. In the Pearl, they're at $50 a foot. that's had to have come down. There's a lot more. You have a lot more leverage just now, right now. If you're looking to get into a space, they're doing some rent abatements where you can get 3 months free, 4 months free, 6 months free. Um,
Sure.
it's they'll probably look at anything is what I would say. Um, as long as you have the risk in opening up a new space in the core, um, when we don't really know when people are going to be back out and about. I'd probably wait it out through winter. I think people might be a little bit nervous going into indoor spaces because right now we can still be outdoors and starting people out and about going into inside indoors, when it's 40 degrees and raining for the next 6 months.
All right. Aaron had a question. I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, good. I was just typing and it was tiresome.
It's okay. Ask your question.
Okay. So I was just thinking, because I wanted to find out, Nick, why you went into commercial from residential. And my question is like, if your goal is to, which is, I'm thinking this is why you did it. If like my goal is to invest in like multifamily, wouldn't our career path be better aligned to then maybe try to do commercial or to learn that side of the business so it's aligned more than just being like a residential real estate broker, but then trying to break into investing in multifamily? Because it goes to commercial if it's over 4 units, right?
Yeah, 5 units and up is going to be commercial financing. It's still, from a tax standpoint, classified as residential. But I think, so I know a lot of people that are successful residential realtors who are also successful multifamily owners. And typically they own smaller properties. There is some more efficiency you get in owning larger properties, but there's nothing wrong with buying smaller properties as you're building a portfolio. But the problem is if you end up with like 30 duplexes, now you've got 30 roofs, 30 water heaters, 30 tax lots, 30 yards, 30 sidewalks. So it can be very inefficient from an operation standpoint. So I think that where you can kind of blur the lines a little bit is the multifamily space, because it's more residential than it is commercial. Even when you're above that unit count, it's still people living somewhere, even if the lending's slightly different. Where you're really need to learn the differences is if you're going to get into owning office and retail, because the way that that market works is so different and the rules and the process is so different. For me, I just was curious about it. My first property I bought happened to be zone commercial. And at the time that was actually really difficult to get the loan because it was like, can you rebuild a house in this zone if it burns down? And different zones, the rules are different. And so I kind of learned it on my own. And then part of it was, as I was doing residential real estate, I met commercial brokers and I thought, man, they're working on these really cool like projects where they have condo towers with retail spaces and they've got these big office buildings and, they had fancier cars than me. And I thought that that would be a really cool thing to learn how to do. And I originally learned commercial real estate because I thought I would get into development. And I realized during the recession that the amount of risk you have to take as a developer was more than I was comfortable with. Because I saw a lot of people lose a lot of money. Some people lost all of their money. And so for me, I didn't want to work that hard to end up in that position. And I think right now we're going to have some people that are going to go through that same process where they've invested a ton of time and money, and the market right now is incredibly difficult for new office and new retail, and even new apartment buildings are slower to lease up than maybe they would have been a couple years ago. So I think I think all knowledge is good in terms of making a business decision. You can have a fantastic career in real estate and just do residential. But yeah, you definitely will have an advantage if you want to invest in office or retail or industrial, if you're also working in that space and just know what the norms are. Just like in residential, if I said, hey, Aaron, what's the average house in your neighborhood going for? That. Whereas I said, what's the average office rent in your neighborhood? That would be something, if you're not in the business, you wouldn't know. So maybe something looks like a great deal, but it really isn't. So it definitely gives you an advantage, and you get to know the other people that are involved in that market. And, you know, Jordan's doing a deal right now. It's listed by a commercial broker. He found out about it off market, probably because he's in the business. And it's a pretty good opportunity. I just bought an office building in Idaho, and I found about it because I knew a commercial broker there who brought it to me. And that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't in the same, I don't think that they wouldn't have brought it to me if we didn't have a relationship as being both commercial brokers. Which commercial brokers do you use?
We have a list of referrals that we use, Lisa. Maybe Katie can share.
Oh yeah, we have a vendor guide, which is not on our website yet, right? I think we're getting it. Katie, I probably muted you.
Correct, but I don't have any commercial brokers on there.
We should have two commercial lenders on there, I think.
Yeah, I'll
Lenders?
share a couple. Lisa, I like to start with some lending brokers that kind of shop around for you a little bit. They often have great relationships with many banks. So if you're getting into something like this, build a relationship with a lending broker that can shop your deal around, and you can usually get the best rate. So that's typically where I start. And
Yeah, we have some resources we can email you guys.
Yeah.
Katie, we have everyone's email, right?
Yes.
Okay, we can follow up with that. We'll send everyone a link to or an attachment of the APOD form as well, so you can kind of play around with that and get familiar with it. And certainly, you know, our company here, City and State Real Estate, we're continuing to grow in Oregon and Washington. You know, I know some fantastic brokers that are transitioning from residential to commercial, and we have a great residential group too. I see some of our folks on the call today, which is exciting, learning more about the biz. And so if you're looking for a place with more mentorship, more opportunity to kind of accelerate your career or transition and add commercial to what you're doing, that's something I'm a big believer in. I don't think you have to be one or the other. You know, I've had a very successful career being able to do both of those things. And if you're a true student and you put yourself to work and learn the skills and ask good questions, I think you can certainly do both. I don't think you have to pick one or the other, and certainly you can. I would say most of the time residential is more predictable. Commercial, bigger highs and lows, like Jordan said, a lot of deals fall apart, but it is fun when you get to close a multi-million-dollar deal and get a six-figure commission. That's a fun day. And it's cool to be able to, for me, the thing I love about commercial too is not only are you helping people with their households, but you're helping the city and kind of helping shape and mold the city as a whole in terms of the neighborhoods and the businesses and the people that are really the leaders of the community. And that's really always exciting to be in the same room as those folks and hear their perspective and learn what's going on from that level. Lisa had another question of, are we going to do additional commercial webinars? We're kind of cycling through these. We try not to do the same class over and over. So we try to do this a couple of times a year. We've recorded this, so we'll be happy to share it with you as well. Katie will be getting that up, I think, on our YouTube channel. And thanks everyone for coming today. I hope you learned some valuable stuff. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to Jordan or I, and we'd be happy to help you out if you've got something going, or if you have a commercial deal that's way too crazy, you can by all means hand it off. We'll give you a healthy referral fee and take great care of your people. So thank you guys so much for coming.
Thanks, Nick.